Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the deep dive where we, as always, try to sift through all of that information out there and kind of boil it down to the good stuff, the stuff you really want to know.
Yeah, cut through all that noise.
Exactly. And today we're going to be looking at some World War II action. And
Some of the good stuff, some intense action.
yeah, well, we've got an expert in military history here to help us break it all down.
Yeah,
And I've already gotten them to promise to keep the jargon to a minimum
I promise.
so that even I can understand it.
That's the goal.
All right, so I am Hari, and I'm going to be geeking out over maps and all the fun historical trivia.
Well, it's great to be here, Hari. I'm Kimi, and as you said, I'm the military history buff, and I do tend to get a little bit excited about the tactical details.
Just a little bit.
But I promise I'll make sure to explain everything clearly. So even if you're not a military expert, you can still follow along.
That's what we like to hear. So are you ready to dive into this lesser known but absolutely fascinating battle? We're talking about the Battle of Mount Austen, the Galloping Horse and the Seahorse.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And this all took place, of course, on Guadalcanal.
That's right. And before we get lost in the jungles of Guadalcanal, I think it's really important to understand why this island, this seemingly random island, was such a strategic hotspot in the Pacific theater.
Yeah, it's easy to forget, looking back, that this wasn't just some random island back then. It was actually super important, for controlling the shipping lanes between the U.S. and Australia.
Oh, definitely. It was a key location.
So the Japanese, they wanted to disrupt those supply lines.
Yeah,
Get a foothold in the region.
yeah,
And the Allies, they knew they had to stop them.
exactly. And that's why the initial Allied landing in August of 1942, which was primarily U.S. forces, I think that really caught the Japanese off guard.
Yeah, it was just the beginning of a very long and bloody campaign.
Oh, absolutely. And the Japanese, they were determined to take back the island, so they responded pretty swiftly.
Oh, yeah.
And they relied heavily on a tactic that became known as the Tokyo Express.
Ah, the Tokyo Express. I love that name. It sounds so much cooler than what it actually was.
It does, doesn't it?
It was basically just them trying to get as many troops and supplies as they could to Guadalcanal as quickly as possible.
Yeah, they were using warships to basically make these high-speed runs to the island.
But it was a bit of a double-edged sword, wasn't it?
It was.
I mean, they got their troops there fast, but they didn't have a lot of space for heavy equipment.
Yeah, that was the problem. They had the speed, but they didn't have the firepower.
Yeah. And smack dab in the middle of all of this was Mount Austen.
Right, Mount Austen, this wasn't just some random hill. This was actually a really valuable strategic position for the Japanese.
I mean, if you look at it on a map, you can kind of see why it was so important.
Yeah.
It gave them a great view of the surrounding area. They could see what the Allies were up to.
Exactly. They could observe, they could direct artillery fire, they could really make life difficult for the Allies, especially at Henderson Field, which was, the main Allied air base on the island.
Right, and let's not forget that the jungle terrain itself was like a whole other enemy they had to fight.
No, absolutely. The jungle was brutal, dense, humid, and full of diseases.
The sources really emphasize how tough it was for both sides, but especially for the Japanese.
Mm.
As their supply lines started getting cut off.
Yeah, they were facing starvation, disease, exhaustion on top of everything else.
It's amazing anyone survived those conditions.
It really is, and I think it's important to remember that when we talk about this battle.
So we've set the stage.
Yeah.
A strategically vital island, a desperate fight for control, and just brutal jungle warfare. But let's dig into why the U.S. decided to focus on taking Mount Austen in the first place. I mean, it wasn't exactly an easy target.
Well, you remember those daring night raids by the Japanese, those Tokyo Express runs we talked about?
Oh, yeah, like mosquito bites. They weren't doing massive damage, but they were annoying and disruptive.
Exactly. They were highlighting just how vulnerable Henderson Field was.
Right, and that was the Allies' lifeline on the island.
Exactly. And so those raids, combined with the constant artillery fire that was raining down from Mount Austen, it really pushed the U.S. command to make a decision.
To take Mount Austen.
Yes, General Pash specifically decided that Mount Austen had to be neutralized. It was just too much of a threat.
So on December 16, 1942, the 132nd Infantry Regiment was sent in to capture Mount Austen.
Tough assignment.
Yeah, and here's a little historical tidbit for you. This regiment has roots going all the way back to the American Revolution and the Civil War.
Wow.
But they were about to face something completely different. This wasn't fighting in open fields. This was jungle warfare.
Yeah, and the Japanese, they'd had plenty of time to prepare for them.
They had this incredible network of bunkers and trenches they had built. It was called the Gifu, named after a prefecture in Japan. that was known for having a really strong castle.
Yeah, it was a seriously impressive defensive system.
Oh, it was. It was designed to make attacking it an absolute nightmare.
And it did. The initial attacks by the 132nd, they were met with fierce resistance, heavy casualties on both sides.
And Hill 27 in particular became this focal point for some of the most brutal fighting of the entire battle.
Yeah, Hill 27, it was just savage, close quarters, combat, hand-to-hand fighting.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like.
It really is.
But the Americans, even though they didn't have a lot of experience fighting in this kind of environment, they managed to capture Hill 27.
They did.
And they did it while facing critical supply shortages.
Yeah, it was a hard-won victory for sure. It showed their resilience and their determination, but it was just the first chapter in the fight for Mount Austen.
Right. The Japanese, they weren't giving up that easily.
Oh, no, not at all. And this is where the arrival of fresh U.S. reinforcements really started to change the tide of the battle. The 25th Infantry Division showed up, and that really boosted American strength on the island.
Yeah, it was a total game changer having a whole new division show up. I mean, they brought in fresh troops, obviously supplies, but also, a renewed sense of purpose, I think.
Yeah, they were ready to break through those Japanese defenses.
But before they could do that, they had to deal with some interesting terrain features.
Right, we're talking about the Galloping Horse and the Seahorse.
The Galloping Horse and the Seahorse, what are those?
Well, that's what the Americans named them based on their shapes, from the aerial photos.
Ah, I see. So even in the middle of this brutal battle, they still had a sense of humor.
Yeah, or maybe it was just a way to make sense of the chaos,
Yeah, but what are we calling it? Those names hit some really intense fighting.
Oh, definitely. The assault on the Galloping Horse in particular, that was a real test for the Americans.
I can imagine trying to attack uphill through thick jungle under constant fire.
Oh, and the heat and humidity were brutal.
Yeah, I read that they had a lot of heat casualties on top of the combat casualties.
Right, and then you add in those sudden downpours that you get in that region.
Oh, yeah, those can be intense.
They were providing some relief from the heat, I guess, but they also made the terrain even more treacherous.
It's amazing how much the environment played a role in this battle.
It really is. But even with all of those challenges, there were still these incredible stories of individual bravery.
Oh, yeah, like that Captain Charles W. Davis.
Right. Captain Davis, his battalion's advance had stalled. They were pinned down by heavy fire from this Japanese-held knoll.
A knoll is just a small hill, right?
Yeah, a small hill. So Davis, he sees his men struggling, and he decides to take matters into his own hands.
What did he do?
He volunteered to lead this small group in a really daring attack. They basically crawled inch by inch to get close to the enemy.
Crawling through the jungle knowing that at any moment you could be shot. That takes guts.
It does. The Japanese, they knew they were coming. They
Yeah.
threw grenades at them, but incredibly, those grenades didn't explode.
Wow, talk about lucky.
Yeah, so Davis and his men, they took advantage of it. They threw their own grenades, took out a bunch of enemy positions, and then Davis does something really amazing.
What do you do?
He stood up, completely exposed to enemy fire, and he starts waving his men forward with one hand while he's firing his rifle with the other.
That's incredible. Talk about leading by example.
He was urging them to keep pushing forward to take the knoll.
That's a story.
And as if on cue, at that moment, a huge thunderstorm rolled in.
Like divine intervention.
Because it gave them the water they desperately needed.
Wow. So Davis's leadership, the thunderstorm, and just the sheer grit of the American troops. They finally took the Galloping Horse.
They did, but that was just one part of the battle. What about the Seahorse?
Yeah, what happened there?
The assault on the Seahorse, it wasn't as dramatic, but it was just as challenging.
How so?
Logistically, it was a nightmare. The 35th Regiment, they had this long, grueling march through dense jungle just to get to their objective.
I can't even imagine trying to move troops and equipment through that kind of terrain.
It was brutal. And then when they finally got there, they ran into some fierce close quarters fighting.
So very similar to Hill 27.
Yeah, a lot of hand-to-hand combat, a lot of casualties on both sides. But even in all that chaos, there were more stories of individual heroism.
Oh, yeah, like Fournier and Hall.
Right. Those two soldiers,
Yeah.
they were instrumental in repelling a Japanese flank attack.
So they basically saved the Americans from a major setback.
They did, and I think their actions really highlight just how much these soldiers were willing to sacrifice for each other.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, how were they even being supplied in all that dense jungle?
Yeah, that was a constant challenge. It required a lot of ingenuity.
I bet.
They used jeep trails as much as they could, but eventually those ran out, and then they had to rely on the local Solomon Islanders.
Oh, yeah, the Islanders played a huge role in this campaign, didn't they?
They did. They knew the jungle better than anyone, and they were willing to help the Americans. They carried supplies through the jungle, often at night. It was incredibly dangerous work.
It sounds like it. Those Islanders were unsung heroes for sure.
They were, but even with their help supplying the troops on the Seahorse, it was proving to be really difficult.
So what do they do?
Well, they got creative. They actually started using B-17 bombers for supply drops.
B-17s, those massive bombers, right?
Yeah, they're typically used for strategic bombing, but in this case, they were dropping supplies to troops in the jungle.
Wow, talk about thinking outside the box. Did it work?
It did. They managed to get the supplies to the troops on the Seahorse, and eventually they were able to capture it.
So both the Galloping Horse and the Seahorse were now in Allied hands. What happened next?
Well, those victories, they actually had a really important strategic consequence. They isolated the Gifu.
The Gifu, the main Japanese stronghold on Mount Austen.
Right, that's the one. So now it was surrounded, cut off from reinforcements and supplies.
What did the Japanese do?
Well, Major Inagaki, the commander of the Gifu, he got orders to abandon his position and try to link up with the main Japanese force.
Makes sense.
But he refused.
He refused.
He felt a sense of loyalty to his men, many of whom were sick or wounded. He said he would fight to the last man.
Wow, that's heavy. It's a powerful example of the Japanese warrior code, isn't it?
It is.
So what did the Americans do? They must have known they had the Japanese trapped.
Well, they didn't want to launch a full-scale assault, to avoid heavy casualties, so they tried to negotiate a surrender.
Did it work?
A few Japanese soldiers surrendered, but most of them stayed with their comrades.
They chose to fight to the death.
They did. They felt a strong sense of duty and loyalty to each other.
It's hard to fathom that kind of commitment.
It really is. So in the end, the Americans decided to use a massive artillery barrage to try to break the Japanese resistance.
A barrage? How much firepower are we talking about?
Over 1,700 shells from various artillery pieces.
Wow, that's a lot.
It was a deafening, earth-shattering display of American might.
Did it work? Did it destroy the Gifu?
Well, it did a lot of damage, but it didn't completely break their will. The Americans attacked the next day and made some progress, but the Japanese were still putting up a fierce fight, and then the rain started coming down again.
Ugh, not the rain again.
Yeah, it turned the whole battlefield into a mud pit, made it really hard to move around and get supplies to the front lines.
So once again, the environment is playing a big role in the battle.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The rain affected both sides, but it probably hurt the Americans more. They relied on heavier equipment and a more complicated supply system.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So what finally broke the Japanese resistance? Did the Americans just overwhelm them with sheer numbers?
Well, numbers definitely played a role, but it was actually a pretty unusual tactic that made the difference. They managed to get a tank up to Mount Austen.
A tank in the jungle.
Yeah, I know it sounds crazy, right? Like bringing a sports car to an off-road race.
Exactly. But I guess it worked.
It did. It turned out to be a game changer. They used the tank to break through the Japanese defenses, something that the infantry couldn't do on their own.
So firepower and maneuverability.
Exactly. They used the tank to punch a hole in the Japanese lines,
And then the infantry poured through.
so classic tactic, but not one you usually see in the jumble.
Right. And with their defenses broken, the remaining Japanese defenders, they were already exhausted and low on supplies. They didn't have many options left.
Surrender or fight to the death.
And knowing what we know about the Japanese mindset, I think we can guess what they chose.
Yes, so what happened?
Major Inagaki, he led his remaining troops in a desperate charge against the American lines.
A suicide mission.
Basically, they were completely outnumbered and outgunned, but they charged anyway. It was a final act of defiance fueled by their warrior code.
And they all died.
Almost all of them, including Inagaki.
It's a tragic end to a brutal battle.
It is. But the Americans had finally taken Mount Austen. They had removed a major threat to Henderson Field and inflicted heavy losses on the Japanese.
But it came at a high price. It did. And as we've discussed, this battle was just one part of a much larger campaign for control of Guadalcanal. While the army was fighting for Mount Austen, the Marines were waging their own offensive along the coast.
Right, they were facing the same kind of challenges, the same kind of brutal fighting.
They were, and eventually they started pushing the Japanese back too.
So the Japanese, they were losing ground on all fronts.
Their supply lines were stretched thin, their troops were exhausted, and the Americans were getting stronger.
So they had to make a tough decision.
They did. They decided to evacuate Guadalcanal.
Wow, after fighting so hard for it.
It must have been a difficult decision, but they really didn't have a choice.
So did they manage to get off the island?
They did. They pulled off a pretty amazing evacuation, actually. Under the cover of darkness, they withdrew to Cape Esperance, where their navy was waiting.
And the Americans, they didn't try to stop them.
No, they didn't realize what was happening at first. They thought the Japanese were preparing for another attack.
So they missed their chance.
In a way, yeah. The Japanese were able to delay the American advance just long enough to get most of their troops off the island.
Wow, so they actually managed to salvage something from a losing situation?
Yeah, they did. They evacuated over 10,000 troops.
That's impressive. But in the end, the Allies won the battle for Guadalcanal.
Oh, yeah. There's no doubt about that.
It was a major turning point in the Pacific War.
It showed that the U.S. could project power across vast distances and that they were determined to defeat Japan.
And for the Japanese, it was a wake-up call.
It was. They realized they couldn't keep fighting the same way. They had to adapt.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. A brutal battle.
Yeah.
Incredible stories of heroism and sacrifice at a turning point in World War II. What's the one thing you want our listeners to remember about this battle?
I think it's important to understand that this battle, it was more than just a footnote in history. It was a microcosm of the whole Guadalcanal campaign. You know, it showed the limits of human endurance, the challenges of jungle warfare, and the clash of cultures that made this war so unique.
Well said. And for our listeners who want to learn more, be sure to check out the sources we used for this deep dive. They're full of detailed accounts, personal stories, and insights into the decisions that shaped the war.
There's always more to learn and explore.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.